All right, everyone, what's up? We're here to do the second part of chapter 6, right? So we're still going to be talking about population and community ecology. So the last video you watched talked a lot about the factors that determine population size. Also talked a lot about different ways to model or predict how a population will grow or decline. But the size of a population tells us nothing about what determines a population's distribution across the planet. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, all right? The distribution of a species around the world is determined by 3 factors, okay? So just like we learned in chapter 5, sorry, Mr. Morales is dying over here. Sorry. Just how we learned in chapter 5, the presence of a species in any given area is influenced by the species' fundamental niche, or the range of abiotic conditions that it can tolerate, if you don't remember what that meant. Also, additionally, for a species to be present in an area, it must be able to disperse to that area. Okay, so that's what we got number 2 here. Kangaroos, for example, are unable to disperse from Australia to North America without human intervention because it's separated by loads and loads and loads of oceans, right? But even though North America has some habitats that might be good for kangaroos that they could thrive in, the ocean serves as an effective barrier to the kangaroo being dispersed, okay? So that's that. The third factor in determining a species distribution is their interaction with other species that you can see right here. So these interactions fall into 4 different categories that we're going to talk about here in a second, but you got competition, predation, there's mutualism, and then commensalism, okay? So it's the study of all these interactions that are going to determine the survival of a species in a habitat. And we call that the science of community ecology. So that's what we're going to talk about. Might look a little confusing. So you can see the days and number of individuals here. When they were living alone in their habitat, you can see that this species here, P. aurelia, grew slowly, reached carrying capacity, and it was a pretty successful population of that species, right? Also, the same thing happened here. It grew slowly, reached carrying capacity, everything is good. Okay? And because of this competitive exclusion principle, right, 2 species competing for the same limited resource cannot coexist. This one basically took over. This one died. Okay, they can't coexist. They're in the same realized niche. So competition for a limited resource can lead to resource partitioning, okay, in which 2 species divide a resource based on differences in the species' behavior or morphology. Okay, so in evolutionary terms, when competition reduces the ability of individuals to survive and reproduce, natural selection is going to favor the individuals that overlap less with the other species and the resources that they use. So let's look at this example here and pretend we got 2 species of birds, okay? Species 1, species 2. These 2 different species of birds eat different sized seeds. Okay, so in species 1, which is represented by this teal color, some individuals eat the small seeds and some individuals eat the medium-sized seeds. Okay, in the second species, some individuals eat the medium-sized seeds and the large-sized seeds, all right? So, and as a result, we have individuals of both of these species that are essentially competing for these medium-sized seeds. So if species 1 is the better competitor for the medium seeds, then the individuals of species 2 right here that compete for those medium seeds are probably going to have poor survival and reproduction, right? So after a whole bunch of generations, species 2 should evolve to contain fewer individuals that eat the medium seeds. You can see here in the second chunk of the graph, okay? But this process, this is what we call resource partitioning. It reduces the amount of competition between 2 species, okay? When we're talking about resource partitioning, there are a few terms that you should be familiar with in your book. There are different types of resource overlap, and the 3 that you should know are called temporal resource partitioning, spatial resource partitioning, and morphological resource partitioning. Okay, so make sure you guys go through your vocab and stuff in your reading guide and you know what those are from your book. But the example that's shown right here that I have for you is an example of spatial resource partitioning. So desert plants have evolved a variety of different root systems that reduce the competition for water and soil nutrients. Okay, some have really deep roots and others have really shallow roots. All right, there's 2 different desert plants shown here. Obviously, you've got the black grama grass and you've got the tar brush. We can see here that the black grama grass has shallow roots that extend only over this area here to capture rainwater. But the tar brush plant right here sends their roots way, 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 way down into the ground so that they can tap into these deep sources of water. And so over time, these 2 species have evolved to coexist in this way. And this way they're still, thriving, and they each have their different part of the soil that they can obtain their water from. So we just talked about competition, right? The second type of interaction with other species that individuals have that can determine a species distribution is predation. So I don't need to go into too many details about this because it's something you've learned before, definitely in biology, but you do need to review it. So there's a whole bunch of information in your book that you should be familiar with. Most of these are pretty straightforward. But predators in all sorts of different examples play really, really critical roles in their ecosystem because they regulate the prey populations, okay? So to avoid being eaten or harmed by predators, lots of different prey species have evolved defenses. The defenses could be behavioral, they could be morphological, or they could be a chemical defense, okay? So some species have camouflage, right? That's a defense. Other species have grown spines to prevent herbivores from grazing on their leaves and fruits, right? It tells them, hey, get away, don't eat me. Some species of frogs can emit chemicals that are super toxic or they're distasteful to predators. So usually those poisonous amphibians and stuff like that are really, really bright colors so that the predators know not to eat them, okay? So also, we'll talk about it later, but that's a type of mimicry that some species have evolved where they're not actually toxic, but they have evolved bright colors to kind of fool the predators so that when predators try to go eat them, they see, oh, they're bright, they must be toxic, but we're not. In reality, they're not toxic, and they just got played. Oh, I just found this the other day, and I thought it was funny because it's November. I'm doing no deforestation November. Isn't this cute, Cody?
And very cute. I had my glasses on. It took me a while to see it.
Cody always tries to do, Mr. Morales always tries to do no shave November. Oh, say hello, Kiba. That's my pupper. And Mr. Morales. Kiba, look at the screen.
Go over here.
I think he's blind.
Hey. Come on.
Aw.
Let's go to the other room. Let's let mommy record.
Okay. So the third type of interspecific interaction is mutualism. Okay, so first we had competition, then we have predation. Now we're talking about mutualism, all right? This benefits interacting species by increasing both the chance of survival and reproduction, all right? So each species in a mutualistic interaction is ultimately assisting another species to benefit itself. Okay, if the benefit's too small, the interaction will no longer be worth the cost of helping the other species. So under these conditions, natural selection is going to favor the individuals that no longer engage in the mutualistic interaction. All right. So there's a whole bunch of different types of mutualistic interactions. We're going to talk about them. But one of the most ecologically important is the relationship between plants and their pollinators. Okay, so different types of pollinators can include birds, bats, insects, all of those types of organisms. But the plants depend on the pollinators for reproduction, and the pollinators depend on the plants for food. Okay, so in some species, one pollinator species might visit. Kiba, get down. He's trying to eat some crumbs off of Mr. Morales' desk. But one pollinator species might visit many species of plants. Some other cases, several plant species can be visited by a wide range of pollinator species. You can also have a situation where one animal species pollinates only one plant species, right? That plant species is not pollinated by any other animal. So they have this really, really close relationship where they've co-evolved over millions of years, which is absolutely insane. And I wish I could talk more about it, but you can talk with me after class about it someday. So an example of this is there's 900 different species of fig trees, fun fact, and almost every single one, single type of fig tree is pollinated by a different species of fig wasp. Okay, so that's crazy. So one really, really cool example, I have a picture here, of plant and animal mutualism is this interaction, right, between the acacia trees and different species of Pseudomyrmex ants, okay, down in Central America. So basically the acacia trees supply the ants with food and shelter, and the ants protect the tree from herbivores and competitors, from stuff from eating it, right? Okay, commensalism, right? You've heard of commensalism. It's a type of relationship in which one species benefits, but the other is not really either harmed or helped. Okay, there's kind of meh. Commensalism includes birds using trees as perches and fishes in coral reefs, living in coral reefs as places to hide from predators. Commensalism, mutualism, and parasitism are all symbiotic relationships, which is a relationship of two species that live in close association with each other. Use this graph right here to help you remember the different types of interaction and whether they are benefited from these interactions or not. So you can see competition, both species are negatively impacted. Predation, one species is positively impacted, the other is negatively. Mutualism involves both species benefiting. Commensalism involves only one species benefiting and the other one just kind of being meh. Keystone species. We talk about this in class a little bit when we do our Wolves of Yellowstone activity, but make sure you're familiar with this term, right? It's a species that plays a role in its community that is far more important than its relative abundance might suggest. Okay, so if we were to remove this species from the food web, nearly every part of the community would be impacted. Okay, so keep that in your noggin. All right, let's talk about a few more things. We've got primary succession. Even without human activity, natural communities do not stay the same forever. Right? Changes in the species composition of communities over time is a supernatural thing. One of these changes is called ecological succession, all right, which is the predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. So depending on the community type, ecological succession can occur over time, spanning from just decades all the way up to centuries. In terrestrial communities, ecological succession can be primary or secondary depending on the starting point of the soil. So we're going to talk about those two different types, right? This picture here is showing primary succession. So primary succession occurs on surfaces that are originally devoid of soil. There's no soil present. Okay, so it could be like an abandoned parking lot. It could be newly exposed rock that is left behind after a glacier retreat or newly cooling lava from a volcano, right? So if you look at the diagram here, you can see the process of primary succession. But basically, it begins when you have these exposed rocks. Over time, you get these simple species like algae, lichens, and mosses growing on the rocks, okay? And we call these the pioneer species, the first species that show up and start surviving during ecological succession. So as these plants grow, the lichens and the mosses and stuff, they're excreting acids that allow them to take up nutrients from the rock. Basically what happens is they die, their organic material from their bodies breaks down, and over time, more nutrients get added to the soil, which gives way to larger plants being able to grow. So that's when you get the annual weeds, and it just keeps happening. There's death, more nutrient soil, bigger plants can grow, and time goes on. And by the end of it, you get this beautiful forest. Secondary succession is a little bit different. It's basically the same thing, except it happens in areas that have been disturbed but not lost their soil. So essentially it's the same thing, just at the beginning there's already soil present. But secondary succession usually happens after an event. It could be like a forest fire, a hurricane, something that removes the vegetation but leaves the soil mostly intact. It also happens in abandoned agricultural fields. So when you guys are driving around some parts out in the country by spring and you see all these areas that maybe they like chop down a forest and stuff's growing back, that's secondary succession happening because there's soil present, but nature has just taken over and everything's growing back. So another difference between secondary and primary succession is at the beginning in primary succession, you've got your algae and your lichens and stuff like that. But here it's a little different. The first organisms to arrive, the pioneer species, are typically plants like grasses and wildflowers and stuff like that. Usually they have really light seeds so that the wind can take them wherever. And yeah, you've got different pioneer species there. Oh, Cody, you'll like this joke. Okay, what did the janitor... Wait, let me just say this. One of you gave me this on your ed puzzle at the end for your little freebie question, and I can't remember who it was, but I laughed out loud when I read this. So, what did the janitor say when he jumped out of the closet? Supplies! Oh, that's pretty good. Oh, kudos to you who gave me that joke. I forgot to write down who gave me them. I'm sorry. But it's funny. All right, so I wanted to show you guys a really, really cool example of ecological succession. Maybe you've heard this, but there's this island off the coast of Iceland. It's called Surtsey, but it didn't form until 1963, and it took about 4 years for it to form, but it's a volcanic island, so basically this volcano just appeared above the surface. You've just got a new island out of nowhere. So this is what it looked like post-eruption. Obviously, it's just cooled lava, so there's nothing there, right? It's bare rock, which means it's going to have to go through succession from beginning to end, okay? So this is what it looks like afterwards, and this is what it looks like today. So obviously, it doesn't have a lot of crazy species, but you can see the lichens and everything growing. You've already got some wild grasses and all that stuff. So it's in the early stages of ecological succession, but it's just so cool. So scientists have made the island off limits to people And anybody that goes there, it's basically an island, just for research. And anybody that goes there has to get fully dressed up in like crazy suits and stuff like that. You can see a station, right? That's where they go to get all their data and work. If you guys ever get a chance to go to Iceland someday, you'll see, because it's a volcanic island and it's geologically really young. Actually, they don't have any native tree species on the island, but they mostly have just like really short shrubs and wild grasses and stuff like that, because it's still in the early stages of ecological succession. So it's really, really, really cool. So different natural disturbances can also make opportunities for succession to happen in aquatic environments. All right. So an example of this is the rocky intertidal zone along the Pacific north coast of America, right? It's exposed to the air during low tide, but during high tide, it's underwater. Now and then major storms turn over the rocks, or they clear them of living things and stuff like that. So the bare rocks have to start being colonized through the process of primary succession. All right, so that's one way that it happens. Another one you might see, and this is in your book, is that sometimes lakes can be filled with accumulating sediments over time. And the lake can basically just disappear and turn into a terrestrial habitat. You can see here at first you have the lake, sediments accumulate there, and then eventually it might fill up and you just have a terrestrial ecosystem. So just like we've seen in the past few chapters, we know that species are not distributed evenly on Earth, right? They're organized into biomes that are organized by global climate patterns and into communities whose competition changes regularly as species interact, right? It's always changing, it's dynamic. So in a given region within a biome, the number and types of species present are determined by 3 basic processes, okay? And these are listed here. You have the colonization of the area by new species, there is the speciation within the area, and the losses from the area by extinction. So the relative importance of these 3 processes varies from region to region, and it's influenced by these 4 factors, okay? Latitude, time, habitat size, and distance from other communities. So let's talk about these real quick. So if we're talking about the latitude, as we move from the equator towards the north to the South Pole, the number of the species goes down. All right, so for example, the southern latitudes of the United States have more than 12,000 species of plants. But if you go up north to Canada, going towards the North Pole, right, there's only about 1,700 species in said area in northern Canada. All right. We also see this pattern in animals like birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects, okay? It's not just trees. Different patterns of species richness, right, the number of species in an area are also regulated by time. Okay, so the longer a habitat exists, the more colonization, speciation, extinction, all of those things can happen there. Older habitats typically have more biodiversity and younger habitats have less. All right, it makes sense. I'm going to talk about these last 2 on the next slide here. So the last 2 factors that influence the number and the size of the species are the size of the habitat and the distance of that habitat from a source of colonizing species. All right, so there's this theory that we're going to be talking about in class, but it's called the theory of island biogeography. This theory demonstrates both the importance of habitat size and distance in determining species richness. So it makes sense, but larger habitats typically contain more species. If you look at the graph here, I'm not going to move the mouse because otherwise it covers up the x-axis. You can see that the larger islands of bird habitat have a greater number of bird species. So down there on the x-axis, it says island area, right? As it goes up, so does the number of bird species. There's a couple different reasons, 3 reasons specifically for this pattern. All right. So the first reason is that dispersing seeds are more likely to find larger habitats than smaller habitats, right? Especially when those habitats are islands. Secondly, at any given latitude, larger habitats can support more species than smaller habitats, which makes sense, right? Larger habitats are capable of supporting larger populations of any given species, and larger populations are less prone to extinction because usually there's more biodiversity there. Third, the last thing is that larger habitats often contain a wider range of environmental conditions, which in turn provide more niches that support a larger number of species. So more species equals more biodiversity equals more protection from all sorts of crazy disasters. And a wider range of environmental conditions also provides that ecosystem greater opportunities for species. So that's all about habitat size, right? Let's talk about the distance between a habitat and a source of colonizing species, because that's the final factor that affects the species richness or the number of species that exist in a community. So let's look at this example. We've got oceanic islands, right? Oceanic islands that are more distant from continents generally have fewer species than islands that are closer to continent. Distance matters because lots of different species can disperse short distances, but only a few species can disperse really long distances. In other words, if we had two species that were the same size, the near islands or the closer islands should accumulate more species than the further away islands because it has a higher rate of immigration by the new species. It's a lot closer. It just makes sense. So these effects of colonization, speciation, and extinction on the species richness of communities have really important implications for conservation as well. It's not just talking about, species migrating to new islands and stuff like that. But this theory, the theory of island biogeography, was originally applied to oceanic islands, but since then it's been applied to habitat islands within a continent. So what the heck is this, right? A habitat island means that it's on land. An example of this would be a national park, right? Usually these areas, the national parks, are full of biodiversity, but they're surrounded by less hospitable habitats that have been altered by humans a whole bunch. And basically, it's an island of biodiversity all on its own. So we have to look at these things and decide, if we want to set aside natural habitats for a given species or group of species, we have to consider both the size of the protected area and the distance between the protected areas to make sure that we can conserve as much biodiversity as possible. Okay, we're done, guys. Here's your riddle. All right, I got to show you the answer to the riddle for the other one in class. I'll do it tomorrow. But I have keys, but no locks, and space, but no rooms. You can enter, but you can't go outside. What am I? We'll see if y'all can figure that out. And I am finally done. I will let you go. I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in class. Bye-bye.